Welcome to the Radical Lifestyle Podcast, brought to you by Generation to Generation, where you will be inspired by the past, equipped for the present, and prepared for the future as we engage in conversations with people from around the world. Hello everyone, this is Andrew and Daphne from Generation to Generation, and our guest is Katharine van der Beek. Now, Katharine's done a couple podcasts before, but for people that haven't heard them, can you just say a little bit about who you are, where you're from, what you do, all that good stuff?
So my name is Katharine van der Beek and I was born in England. I lived just outside of London in a really tiny place. I trained as a musician for many, many years, following in the footsteps of my mother. And I made Aliyah in 2005, moving to Israel. In the same year, I was actually married. And now I live just outside of Jerusalem with my 3 children. Until February of this year, I was working as a tour guide. But actually, to tell you the truth, many times since I've lived in Israel, it's been a case of reinventing myself and finding different things to do with my time. So in the last months, I've gone from being a tour guide to being a homeschooling mum and putting as much of my teaching online as I possibly can. So today, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to bring the spotlight for a moment back to the Middle East. While the world's media is concerned with COVID-19 and with the American election, there have been some really eye-opening events in the Middle East that have by and large escaped the attention of even the Israeli believers. And yet, Israel is God's prophetic time clock. And if we truly want to understand the times in which we are living and what to do, we need to keep at least one eye on Israel, on Jerusalem, and on the Temple Mount. So today, we're going to speak a little bit about the archaeology and the history of the Temple Mount in connection with the biblical account. And then afterwards, we'll turn our eyes to the future of the Temple Mount and consider some of today's headlines in the light of biblical prophecy. So I would really like to begin with a beautiful, hope-filled portion of scripture before we delve into the details of more difficult subjects. So I'm going to read a little bit of Ezekiel 47 from verse 1 to 12. And this portion of scripture is sandwiched between 2 passages, the first of which appears to be a description of a future temple in Jerusalem, while the second gives us the future borders of the land of Israel. Now, scholars believe that no temple of this description has yet stood in Jerusalem, and the wonderful event described in the following passage has clearly not yet taken place, unless, of course, we interpret it figuratively. I would go with a plain, simple, literal reading of the text. So starting at verse 1, "Then he brought me back to the door of the house. Behold, water was flowing out from under the threshold of the house eastwards, for the front of the house faced east. The water was flowing down from under the right side of the house, south of the altar. He brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around outside by way of the outer gate, the way of the gate looking east. Behold, water was trickling out from the right side. When the man went out eastwards with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits. Then he led me into the water to the knees. Again he measured 1,000 and led me into the water up to the waist. Again he measured 1,000, and now it was a river I could not pass through, for the water had risen, water to swim in, a river that could not be crossed. He said to me, 'Have you seen this, son of man?' Then he brought me back to the bank of the river. When I had returned, behold, there were very many trees on one side and on the other, along the bank of the river. Then he said to me, 'These waters go out towards the eastern region. They go down to the Arava and enter the sea. When they arrive at the sea, the waters of the sea will flow and will become fresh. It will be that every living creature that swarms will live wherever the rivers go. There will be a very great multitude of fish, because this water goes there and makes the salt water fresh. So everything will be healed and live wherever the river goes. Fishermen will stand by it from Ein Gedi to Ein Eglaim. It will be a place for spreading of nets. Their fish will be of many different kinds, like the fish of the Great Sea, a huge quantity. Its swamps and its marshes will not become fresh. They will be set aside for salt. On the river, on its bank, on this side and that side, will grow every kind of tree for food. Its leaf will not wither. Its fruit will not fail. it will bear new fruit every month because its water flows out from the sanctuary. Its fruit will be for food, and its leaf will be for healing. Now, in the autumn of 2018, it seemed like God was highlighting this very passage. In Israel, we have permanent riverbeds, and we also have seasonal ones that are called wadis. So what actually happens with the wadis is that when we have rainfall in the Jerusalem hills, it takes time before that rainfall gets down to the area of the Judean desert where it eventually flows into the Dead Sea. So if you can imagine little trickles of water joining together and becoming streams, and then those streams join together so that by the time they reach the Dead Sea, they actually become rushing torrents. So they're beginning high up in the mountain, and then they're rushing down towards the lowest place on earth. And when they get there, they have so much power and so much volume of water that they can rush away vehicles, they can drown people. Usually every year, people die in these flash floods because they get caught in their path. But what actually happened in October 2018 was extraordinary. There was a record-breaking rainfall, and what actually happened was that the water rushing down towards the Dead Sea was particularly strong. So when it reached an area called Avnat, where there's a little village just on the shores of the Dead Sea, and the water got to the road, and the water was supposed to flow in a pipe underneath the road, but the volume was so enormous that the road actually exploded, and you could see the road shattering from right to left or from left to right, depending on which direction that you were facing. Now, if God is God, he can choose to break the road any place that he wants. But what was really extraordinary was that the place where the road broke was in the Kidron Valley. Now, if you know anything about the geography of Jerusalem and the geography of the area going down to the Dead Sea, the Kidron Valley actually begins on the eastern slope between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. So if you imagine this vision of Ezekiel, you have the gate facing east. What is exactly below that gate is the Kidron Valley. That means that water, if it was truly flowing in a literal vision of Ezekiel, would probably flow in the Kidron Valley right to the Dead Sea. And that is where the road shattered. I felt in that moment that God was underlining Ezekiel 47, and he was reminding us that one day this is going to happen. There's going to be water flowing from under the eastern gate, and everything is going to come to life again. And this is such a wonderful, hope-filled vision. And of course, Zechariah 14 tells us that this is going to take place when Yeshua himself places his feet on the Mount of Olives. So there's a possibility that it won't be the Kidron Valley because, of course, Zechariah 14 tells us that at the moment that he places his feet on the Mount of Olives, the mountain is going to split in two. So I suspect that he's going to rearrange the geography of Jerusalem rather dramatically. But it was just so extraordinary to me that the one place where the road broke that autumn was exactly in the Kidron Valley, the very valley that is located right underneath the eastern gate of the temple.
Wow.
So we're going to spend a few minutes just speaking about the Temple Mount, both historically and archaeologically. And I want to begin with a simple question. Is it possible to know where the Jewish temple stood, since it's now nearly 2,000 years after the destruction of the Temple of Herod, the same temple that Yeshua himself stood in? I say temples and not temple because there were 3 temples that stood on the Temple Mount. The first was the temple that King David had in his heart to build, but he couldn't because he had too much blood on his hands. And because of this, his son Solomon, or Shlomo in Hebrew, which means peace or wholeness, was given the task. Now, the second temple to be built in exactly the same location was the temple of Zerubbabel. And this was built when the southern kingdom of Judah came back from exile in Babylon. The third was the temple of King Herod, who greatly expanded the platform, the temple, and her precincts to make her into one of the wonders of the ancient world. Now, I mentioned that the temple of Zerubbabel was built on exactly the same place that the first temple was built, the Temple of Solomon. How do we actually know that? Well, we know that because the book of Ezra tells us that in chapter 2 and verse 68. And several hundred years later, King Herod greatly expands the Temple Mount and essentially builds the third temple. But if we go back a little bit before this, we have proof that the temple really was built on Mount Moriah. Now, there are some theories that would say that the temple was not built on Mount Moriah, but it was built lower down in the city of David. But in order to believe this unfortunate theory, we first need to throw out the biblical account, and we also need to throw out the overwhelming burden of archaeology that I'm going to begin to describe for you. So the first step is when King David purchases the threshing floor of Aruna the Jebusite in order to make a sacrifice. Now, in fact, he's taken a census of the people. He was not supposed to do that. God is angry, and there's a plague, and King David wants to buy a piece of earth upon which he can make a sacrifice. And this is recorded for us in 2 Samuel 24, verse 21 to 25. A threshing floor where the wheat is separated from the chaff needs wind, so the location cannot be in the lowest place because the wind would not be able to perform its function if that was the case. Now, Jewish worship, in contrast, is forbidden on the highest place, and so Mount Moriah would perfectly fit both these constraints. It's not the highest place. The Mount of Olives to the east is quite a bit higher than Mount Moriah and separates Jerusalem from the desert to the east. Now, an interesting detail for us living through this COVID-19 is that God stopped the plague when David made a sacrifice in this place. This also connects to the frequently quoted scripture, 2 Chronicles 7, verse 14, that everyone is praying and believing for in these days, because actually in verse 13, it says that when God sends a plague, he will hear the prayers from this place, and if the people fulfill the conditions that he gives in the following verses, he will heal their land. Now, in 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1, that gives us the proof that this threshing floor is indeed the site where David built an altar. And in addition, this is indeed where King Solomon built the first temple, because it says there, then Solomon began to build the house of Adonai in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where Adonai appeared to his father David at the place that David prepared on the threshing floor of Aruna the Jebusite. So it connects all those things together in this verse. He began to build on the second day of the second month in the 4th year of his reign. Now the foundation that Solomon laid for the building of the house of God was 60 cubits long and 20 cubits wide, according to the old standard. So it even gives us very exact dimensions of the size of this platform. In 2 Chronicles 5, verse 2, it specified that King Solomon took the ark from the city of David up to Mount Moriah. And again, I'm mentioning this just because of this theory that the temple once stood in the city of David, which is impossible unless you throw out these two particular verses. So the burden of the archaeological proof, in addition to the biblical account, is really overwhelming. And I'm going to describe some of that just now. So the way that I'm going to describe it is actually to begin with the lowest point of the city of David, which is to the south of ancient Jerusalem. I'm going to begin at the meeting point of 3 valleys. And these valleys were called the Hinnon, the Kidron, and the Tarapaean valleys. And this low point, if you can imagine that water naturally will flow to a low point, so it was used historically as a place to lead water to from the Gihon spring, as well as to store and to protect the water source of the city. Now, at the time of Yeshua, the recently discovered pool of Siloam, or pool of Shiloach, was located there. And this is the very pool where Yeshua sent the blind man to wash the mud off of his eyes. This pool can be visited today along with part of the Pilgrim's Path that is also called the Final Ascent, which leads from the pool all the way up to the Temple Mount. So as it goes up towards the Temple Mount, it's going exactly due north. Now, this road was used for approximately 40 years, from 30 to 70 AD, and was almost new when it was buried under the rubble of Jerusalem, when she was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So it functioned during the 3 most important years of Yeshua's earthly ministry. Now, at the top of the city of David, further to the north than where this pool was located, there are two areas that were mentioned in scripture that have been found, along with numerous bulla or clay seals that were preserved by fire destruction of Jerusalem at the end of the First Temple period. Each bulla or clay seal has a name on it, and several of those names can be found in the book of Jeremiah, who was, of course, the prophet of the destruction of Jerusalem. The seals of Hezekiah and Isaiah were even found very close to each other and in the same destruction layer at the foot of the Temple Mount. And these two areas were called the Milo and the Ophel. The Milo is actually found in three corresponding passages of Scripture, 2 Samuel 5 verse 9, 1 Chronicles 11 verse 8, and 1 Kings 9 verse 15, and it's also known as the stepstone structure. It is a retaining wall upon which the palace of King David once stood. The Ophel, in contrast, is an area between the Temple Mount and the city of David, and is the area where King Solomon had his palace. It's mentioned in 2 Chronicles 27 verse 3, and both these areas can be visited. This is extraordinary. These are 3,000-year-old structures that we can find and that we can go and see today. Above the area of the Ophel, there are more than 53 ritual baths. We should also consider actually that the pool of Siloam or Shiloah was also used as a vast ritual bath for the pilgrims who were coming up to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the feast of the Lord. They are well preserved and clearly visible, and there is no other possible use for them. At the top of the pilgrim's path or final ascent, so now we've gone a long way north and we've got right to the base of the Temple Mount. Now, fascinatingly, the width of the staircase right at the base of the Temple Mount is identical to the width at the very bottom of the valley where the pool of Shiloah is, and it's an incredible 70 meters or 210 feet wide. So clearly large numbers of people were walking up this ancient path. And it's beautiful because the prophet Isaiah says, clear the stones, prepare the highway for the way of the Lord. And that is exactly what is happening archaeologically in Jerusalem as they are clearing this ancient path so that once again we will be able to walk all the way from the city of David right up to the Temple Mount. Now, at the top of this path, there were several entrances to be able to ascend from below the Temple Mount onto the Temple Mount itself. 2 of these went underneath the building via an internal staircase that has been preserved until today and is still intact but inaccessible unless you happen to be a Muslim. These entrances were via 2 gated entrances that were later named the Huldah Gates, and the impressions of these gates, you can still see them if you look at the southern wall of the Temple Mount. Now, if you can imagine that right now we're facing the southern wall of the Temple Mount, but if we would walk a little bit around the corner to the left-hand side, we would get to the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount. And here there is evidence of another entrance up onto the Temple Mount, but this time it's not going underneath the building, it's actually an external staircase that went around the side of it. This is known today as Robinson's Arch, and it has recently been authoritatively dated to the end of the Second Temple period. Now, just underneath this arch is one of my favorite findings because I'm a musician. And just under this, there was a large stone found that had clearly fallen from right above on top of the Temple Mount. And on it, there was an inscription that says, the place of trumpeting. So that was the place where the trumpet and also the shofar would be sounded to tell the people of important things that were happening. Perhaps it was saying, gather the people, there's an enemy army coming. Or perhaps it was saying, hey guys, there's an hour until Shabbat, you need to make sure that you get home. All of these kind of instructions that could be given to the people. And in fact, it was said that the smell of the temple, of the incense, and the sound of the shofar could be heard as far away as Jericho. So the smell and the sounds would have carried a considerable distance from the Temple Mount. Now, in front of this area where this stone fell, there were a lot more stones that fell, and they were huge. Some of them weighed several tons, and they had clearly fallen from a great height because below on the street level, you can see the impact of where they landed. So it's as if a moment was frozen in time, and that moment was 70 AD when the Romans threw stones from the temple down onto the street below, causing such an impact that you can still see it today. And this was one of the main thoroughfares of the city. And of course, we know that Yeshua in Luke 21, verse 6, said that not one stone would stand upon another. And they don't. If you go on top of the Temple Mount, you will not find any stone from the temple, but you will find stones below that fell from the great height during the destruction. Now, also, what was found on top of the Temple Mount was a Greek inscription that was meant for Gentiles to read. That was why it was written in Greek. And it stated, "Do not come closer to the temple on pain of death," because the Gentiles would not have been allowed into the inner courts of the temple. They were only allowed in the outer courts. So if we would go up on the Temple Mount, we also find another very interesting detail. The Muslims tried to destroy a lot of the archaeological evidence up there, covering it up with stones and with soil and so on. But there's one place where they were not such good archaeologists, and they didn't realize that some of the stones at the bottom of a stairway that is just below the platform upon which the Dome of the Rock stands today actually date to the First Temple period and mark the very corner of the platform upon which the temple stood at the time of Solomon. And just as earlier I read you the dimensions of the temple, we can actually trace those dimensions to the eastern wall of the Temple Mount and see that the masonry from the First Temple period, from the time of Solomon, actually matches to this corner. So you can start to get a feeling that there are so many pieces of evidence from on top of the Temple Mount, from below the Temple Mount, from around every side of the Temple Mount that gives us clues that the temple really did stand up there. Now, of course, on top of the Temple Mount today, there is the very striking structure that everybody knows from photos with the golden dome on top, called the Dome of the Rock. But what many people don't know is that underneath of that is actually the bedrock of Mount Moriah, and that in the bedrock of Mount Moriah, there is an impression that is carved out by human hands, and it looks like a little platform upon which something could have stood. Many archaeologists believe that the something that stood on top of there was the Ark of the Covenant, and that actually that marks the location of the Holy of Holies. Now, something that would support that theory would be the fact that underneath of it, there are actually some channels and like a secret passageway, if you will. And one idea that people talk about sometimes is that perhaps that was made so that if during the reign of Solomon there were enemy armies approaching, that the ark could be taken to a place of safety underneath the Temple Mount and removed from the city, and perhaps even a fake one put above so that an enemy army would think, great, we've captured the Ark of the Covenant, whereas in reality the real one was safely stored somewhere else. Now, there was a person also who mapped everything from underneath the Temple Mount. This was Charles Warren, and he began doing this in the late 1800s. It's still the most accurate mapping of the Temple Mount that we have today. And in fact, if you go into the Western Wall tunnels, which is a way to walk underground underneath the Temple Mount, you can actually see all of his detailed diagrams, that are actually still stored underneath the Temple Mount today. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, a fascinating discovery was released by Lane and Kathleen Rittmeyer, who are two of the most important archaeologists connected with the Temple Mount, and they actually believe that they have found the rooms where the musical instruments that were used by the Levites would have been stored underneath the temple. And if you're interested in that, you can check it out at their website, which is rittmeyer.com, where they have all kinds of fascinating information and diagrams about the temple. Now, if we continue our journey going north, we've almost got to the northernmost place that I'm going to discuss now, we would get to the pools of Bethesda. And of course, that is where in John 5, the paralytic man is lowered into the water finally, and he is healed by Yeshua. So he's been waiting 38 years to be lowered into the water. No one puts him in, but then Yeshua comes along and tells him to pick up his mat and to walk. A wonderful moment. Now, the pools of Bethesda are actually maybe the least disputed archaeological site in Jerusalem. Nobody argues that they are what they say they are. So if you think about the general picture that I've just painted for you, we have the pool of Shiloach, We have the pilgrim's path going up to the Temple Mount. We have the gates. We have all the entrances. We have evidence on top of the Temple Mount. We have evidence below the Temple Mount. We have evidence to the north, the south, the east, and the west. So I think we really can say that the burden of proof that the Jewish temple stood up there is really overwhelming. It would be very, very hard to argue with that. Now, biblically, it would seem to be clear from scriptures like Matthew 24 and Daniel 9 to 11 that before the return of Yeshua, the Antichrist will set himself up in the rebuilt temple. Now, when Yeshua's disciples questioned him about the end of the age and when all these things will take place, in Matthew 24, verse 15, he refers them to the book of Daniel, quoting from Daniel 9, verse 27, which refers to the setting up of the abomination that causes desolation. And Yeshua clearly seemed to be referring to this passage as a future event. So it can't really refer only to Antiochus, although he's, of course, a very clear prototype of the Antichrist. Now, it could arguably refer to the Islamic structures that currently stand on the Temple Mount. In a sense, they are a very real abomination that causes desolation as many thousands of people go up there to worship Allah. But in Matthew 24, it seems to be referring to a very specific moment in time. And those structures have been standing there for several hundred years. And that at that moment of time, it will be necessary yet again for the Jewish people to flee from Jerusalem and to flee from Judea to a place of safety. Now, in these days, a subject of intense debate and interest is where on top of the Temple Mount the temple would be constructed, and if it would be possible to build it without destroying the Dome of the Rock, or if somehow the Dome of the Rock first has to be removed, as the Jewish people actually wanted to do in 1967 when Jerusalem came back into Israeli hands. There were some let's maybe call them extremists who wanted to blow up the Dome of the Rock, and Moshe Dayan actually had to almost physically restrain them from doing this. So there are two mainstream archaeological opinions as to exactly where the temple stood on top of the Temple Mount. So I mentioned one of them already, that the Holy of Holies was perhaps underneath where the Dome of the Rock is today. Now, the primary objection to that theory is that actually the Dome of the Rock is not exactly in line with the Eastern Gate. And the problem with that is that the historian Josephus, who is a very detailed writer, who was an eyewitness to the temple, makes it sound as if the Dome of the Rock and the Eastern Gate should be exactly aligned, that you could see in a straight line from one through the other. Now, you could solve that in two ways. One, you could say, well, in that case, we haven't yet found the Eastern Gate. It must still be somewhere in that wall, and we haven't discovered it yet, because the gate that everyone calls the Eastern Gate actually is not from the time of Yeshua. It's from later on. But in fact, there is a more ancient gate buried underneath it. And I love this because scripture says, lift up your heads, ye ancient gates, so that the King of Glory may come in. In my imagination, I love to imagine him coming and putting his feet on the Mount of Olives and the mountain splitting in two and the ancient gate being exposed underneath. So the other way to say that is, first we said, okay, so maybe we haven't found the gate. The other way to say it is, okay, so we found the gate, so the location can't be quite right. And we're not talking about very far apart, to be honest. We're talking about 10, 20 meters of separation between where it should be if it would be in exact alignment. But the guys that say, okay, the gate must be correct, would place the location of the Holy of Holies slightly to the north. And in that place on the Temple Mount, there is a little shrine called the Dome of the Spirits, and underneath it there is some rock exposed. Some people say that that is also bedrock of Mount Moriah. Other people say, no, that is Herodian masonry. So is it possible that the temple could be rebuilt without destroying the Dome of the Rock? Well, if the more northern location is correct, then yes, it could be, assuming that the temple must be built like the former ones were in exactly the same location as it was before. Now, Revelation 11 verse 2 says that the outer court of the temple has been given to the nations, and they will trample it for 42 months or 3.5 years, perhaps the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period and the time of the two witnesses. So some would suggest that this could imply the possibility of a temple standing there without the necessity of the Dome of the Rock. If the future temple must be built on the original foundations, that would make the exact location the northern one and not the southern one, assuming that the two structures are standing there together. Now, later on in another podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords and what is being proposed for Abu Dhabi. Now, if we think about the structure that is being proposed for Abu Dhabi to house the three Abrahamic religions, you can clearly see in the design, I don't know if you've seen pictures of it, if not, it's very easy to find them online. You see a three-part structure, and there will be one section for each of the Abrahamic religions. Could it be, God forbid, that something like this would sit atop the Temple Mount? And could it be that that is what will give it its name, the abomination that causes desolation? There has never been a multi-faith structure up on the Temple Mount historically. And I can imagine that God would almost hate that more than having an Islamic structure, because this is a greater deception, right? If we're going to try to marry the three Abrahamic faiths and say that they're all equal and that they are worshiping the same God, that's moving towards blasphemy rather than just worshiping a false God. Now, a friend of mine who formerly worked for the office of one of Israel's prime ministers actually claimed to have seen architectural plans for a temple complex, and it was shaped like a pyramid, and it had 3 feet on the base of the structure. So if you can imagine the pyramid at the top and then 3 buildings at the bottom, one for Christianity, one for Islam, and one for Judaism. I can't verify if that's true. I have to trust my friend who told me that. But that is what she claims to have seen. And I think that this is where the connection between the Abraham Accords and the Temple Mount becomes very important, which is why later we will focus also on the Abraham Accords. So let's spend a few moments to see if there are any possible indicators of our being at all close to the building of a temple. Some people believe that the temple will be rebuilt. Other people believe that the temple will not be rebuilt. Some people believe that it is a whole figurative thing. But if we start to look at the practical preparations that the Jewish people have made to build this temple, it is clear that for the Jews, this is something real, and this is something practical, and this is something imminent that is taking place in front of our eyes. And I asked myself, could it be that this will be a suddenly of God, where preparations have been made behind the scenes, so that to us, it will seem like it happened very fast, whereas in fact it didn't. It's just that we didn't pay any attention to it. So in practical terms, here are some of the preparations that have already been made for the building of a temple. So first of all, there is massive construction of infrastructure, roads, railways, tunnels, and they're even beginning working on a cable car that will go up towards Mount Moriah and the Mount of Olives. A number of years ago, Israel's transport minister stated publicly that the reason for all of this construction was to enable the Jews to pray on the Temple Mount, which in itself is extraordinary enough. But he actually went one step further, and he said that the ultimate aim was to enable the Jews to come from all over the country and all over the world to pray in the temple. This is a transport minister saying something like this. It's quite extraordinary. There is an exquisite underground synagogue that is very close to the Temple Mount and was constructed in recent years. It seems that no expense was spared for this, and yet I have never seen a service held there, despite the fact that I have gone under those tunnels and taken people through there very many times. It's rumored that President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually met in that room, and it has 71 seats for the Sanhedrin plus 1. For whom, we may ask, is that extra seat? Is it for the Messiah, or is it for the counterfeit who will precede him, deceiving even the very elect? If they really did meet there, were they speaking of a future false peace deal that will later be ratified by the Antichrist, as is mentioned in Daniel 9, verse 27? Could this relate to the deal of the century, or to the Abraham Accords, which seems now to have become a precursor to the deal of the century? Every article has been built or prepared for use in the Third Temple, including the altar, the golden menorah, harps, incense shovels, and everything else that would be needed. The Jewish people even claim that they know where the Ark of the Covenant is held, and there would seem to be some evidence to support this, despite the fact that the Ark has not officially been seen since the destruction of the first temple. Jacob's sheep were bred in Canada and imported amidst great difficulty. It is also said that a red heifer has been approved for use for ritual purification. And again, that is something that has not happened since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The Sanhedrin has also been selected, although this is not an officially approved decision by the wider Israeli public. In a sense, it's a self-appointed Sanhedrin. A high priest has been chosen, again, not by the wider Israeli public. Priests are receiving training and garments are being made. Biblical ceremonies have begun to be introduced, such as the water libation ceremony of the Feast of Sukkot, the sighting of the new moon, and the marking of the biblical borders of Jerusalem. Most dramatic and shocking is that sacrifices have already been made on the altar that was prepared for use in the temple. For example, just after Hanukkah 2018, so actually just a couple of months after the water rushed towards the Dead Sea and broke the road, a sacrifice was made just outside the walls of Jerusalem. One participant stated on record, and you can find this on YouTube also, "I would rather go back to the gas chambers of Europe than accept the Christian Messiah." And this devastating statement reminded me of when the Jewish people said of Yeshua, "May his blood be upon us and upon our children." A Noahide sacrifice was also made by a Gentile Christian in front of Jewish observers on the Mount of Olives during the days of awe. I think it was the year before last. It may be that sacrifices have not been made in this manner since the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, with the exception of the Samaritans who live on Mount Gerizim and still offer a sacrifice at Passover every year. So it's pretty clear that the Jewish people have an expectation that the temple is going to be rebuilt, that it's going to be soon. They have also a very clear expectation that Messiah is coming soon. There are rabbis that are warning the Jewish people, don't leave the land because he's already here. There are even rabbis that claim to have had conversations with the Messiah, which is pretty concerning since we know that when Yeshua comes, every eye is going to be able to see him. There will be no doubt about that moment, whereas the one that will be revealed is the Antichrist. And interestingly, there are Muslims also who are claiming to have had conversations with their Messiah-like figure or Mahdi. So all of the indications in the Middle East are that there is a very high degree of what I would call messianic expectation. The Jewish people and the Muslims also believe that the Messiah has already or is about to step onto the stage of world history, and that all of these preparations are being made for that moment. So we truly live in extraordinary times where we need to lift up our heads, for our redemption is drawing near.
Wow, Katharine. I mean, I don't think we can say anything to follow that. Thank you. I think anybody who listens to this is going to need to listen to it many, many times. And thank you not only for giving us the facts of the matter, but the heart. And I think the heart comes through as loudly as the facts. And just thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of food to chew on there, and to think through. You certainly feel the urgency, of the hour, as we listen to you talk. And we look forward to part 2. And for everyone else as well, really, really listen to the words that were spoken here and pray about it and consider what's been said. We look forward to part 2. Thank you, Katharine, for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If it inspired you, please rate us and subscribe on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or another podcast platform.